Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. People don't level up in public without someone quietly rearranging their reality first. That's the part nobody likes to admit. We love the fairy tale version of success, the overnight glow-up, the sudden discipline, the dramatic before and after montage with heroic music in the background. But real transformations don't work like that. Behind every shocking 0-100 overhaul, there's usually an unseen influence that made staying the same feel illegal. And whether they deny it, downplay it, or joke it off, one thing keeps slipping through the cracks. Your name keeps hovering around the story. Here's a fact that makes people uncomfortable. Behavioral psychology shows that most drastic personal changes don't come from internal motivation alone. They come from prolonged exposure to a higher standard. Not advice, not encouragement, exposure. When someone spends enough time around a person whose habits, mindset, and self-respect operate on a different frequency, their nervous system recalibrates. Their old normal starts to itch. Their excuses start sounding stupid in their own head. And suddenly, what looks like random growth is actually delayed pressure, finally snapping into motion. That's why this situation feels funny in the most ironic way. You didn't sit them down with a whiteboard. You didn't give them a step-by-step blueprint. You probably weren't even trying to help. Yet here we are, people whispering, side-eyeing, connecting dots like amateur detectives in a low-budget crime series. Nah, it wasn't them, but ever since they showed up, everything changed. Sure. And water just decided to boil out of vibes. What really keeps people glued to this story is not the transformation itself, it's the denial surrounding it. The way credit gets dodged, deflected, and nervously laughed off. Because admitting influence means admitting proximity matters. It means acknowledging that being around the right person can quietly dismantle years of mediocrity. And that truth messes with people who prefer to believe growth is random, self-contained, and emotionally convenient. So this isn't about taking credit, it's about exposing the uncomfortable mechanics behind sudden excellence. Because whether they say it out loud or not, the upgrade didn't happen in isolation. And deep down, everyone watching can feel exactly where the shift started. Number 1. They don't see your face in the transformation. They see your fingerprints all over it. Nobody can point to a single moment where you stepped in and made the change happen. And that's exactly why the suspicion sticks. Real influence doesn't leave behind a selfie or a receipt. It leaves patterns. When someone goes from barely trying to suddenly moving with precision, discipline, and confidence, people don't just clap and move on. They start scanning for the unseen factor that shifted everything. And when your presence overlaps with that timeline, the dots connect themselves. What they're reacting to isn't your involvement in a practical sense, it's your imprint. The way you operate changes the air around you. Being near you subtly alters how effort feels, how time is used, and how excuses sound in a person's own head. You didn't have to coach them or correct them. They watched how you moved, how you handled pressure, how you didn't negotiate with your standards. That kind of exposure rewires behavior without permission. That's why people say your fingerprints are on it. Fingerprints are never loud, but they're specific. Once noticed, they're impossible to ignore. The discipline looks familiar. The confidence has your tone. Even the way they cut off distractions feels borrowed. Observers may not be able to explain it cleanly, but something about the upgrade carries your signature, and that makes people uneasy. The funny part is that denial actually strengthens the narrative. If you had been loudly involved, the transformation would feel manufactured. Instead, it looks organic, almost accidental, which makes your influence feel more powerful. You weren't hovering, you weren't managing outcomes, you were simply present, and presence alone was enough to disrupt their old rhythm. People underestimate how much humans absorb from proximity. We copy standards before we copy skills. We inherit urgency before we inherit strategy. So when someone's entire way of moving changes, it's natural for outsiders to say, "That didn't come from nowhere." They might never give you public credit, but privately, they already know. You didn't need to be in the spotlight for the change to carry your mark. The results speak in your language, and everyone who's paying attention can hear it clearly. Number 2, your presence forced them to confront how average they had been living. Nothing makes a person uncomfortable faster than realizing they've been coasting while calling it doing their best. You didn't walk in and insult them. You didn't point out their flaws. You didn't need to. The contrast did all the work. Just by existing at a higher level, you highlighted how much effort they'd been withholding from their own life. That kind of exposure is quiet, but it hits deep. Before you showed up, average felt safe. It felt normal. Everyone around them was moving at the same pace, making the same excuses, celebrating the same small wins. There was no reason to question it. But your presence disrupted that comfort. Suddenly, their routines felt lazy. Their goals felt half-baked. Things they used to be proud of started feeling unfinished. Not because you said anything, but because the gap became obvious. What really stung was the realization that the gap wasn't about talent or luck. It was about choice. Watching you operate showed them what was possible with focus, discipline, and self-respect. And once that truth landed, they couldn't unsee it. The old story of "this is just how life is" stopped working. Average wasn't a personality anymore. It was a decision they'd been making daily. That's where the overhaul began. Not from motivation, but from embarrassment. The private kind. The kind that shows up late at night when nobody's watching and your own standards start interrogating you. They didn't want to become you. They wanted to stop feeling small around their own potential. That discomfort turned into action, fast and aggressive. From the outside, it looks like a sudden glow-up, a miraculous jump from zero to unstoppable. But inside, it was more like cleaning house after realizing how messy things had gotten. They raised their effort because staying the same felt worse than the pain of changing. And because you were the catalyst for that realization, people naturally link the transformation back to you. You didn't make them feel inferior. You made mediocrity feel unacceptable. That's a powerful thing. Once someone outgrows average, there's no going back, and everyone can trace the moment that shift began. Number 3, you didn't teach them what to do. You showed them what was no longer acceptable. The most powerful transformations don't happen because someone handed out instructions or spelled out a step-by-step plan. People can get advice from anyone. They can watch tutorials, read books, and follow influencers all day long. Yet the jump from zero to elite only happens when someone shows them, without saying a word, that their old ways won't fly anymore. That's exactly what you did. You didn't need to lecture or micromanage. Your standard alone was loud enough. By existing at a higher level, by refusing to settle or make excuses, you created a living benchmark. Anything less than that benchmark started to feel embarrassing. Their old habits, their shortcuts, their good enough attitude, all of it became intolerable. You didn't have to convince them. They figured it out on their own. But the realization hit harder because it was theirs to confront. No one likes being caught in their own complacency, and you put them there without even touching the situation. This is why people often misread your influence. They assume there must have been secret coaching, manipulation, or intervention. They can't understand how someone could overhaul their life seemingly overnight. But what you did was subtler and far more powerful. You rewired what they considered acceptable for themselves. Once that line was drawn, there was no going back. Choices that once felt harmless now felt like self-betrayal. Actions that used to feel normal now felt lazy. The transformation didn't come from adding more effort. It came from removing tolerance for mediocrity. And the best part is that this kind of influence sticks permanently. It isn't a temporary motivator. It's a realignment of identity. Once someone adjusts to a higher standard, everything else in their life shifts around it. The results are obvious, undeniable, and often breathtaking. Outsiders sense it immediately, and that's why credit quietly finds its way back to you. Even without intention or interference, you became the invisible architect of their leap. Their 0 to 100 overhaul carries your signature because you didn't teach them. You redefined what they would no longer accept for themselves. Number 4. They absorbed your standards before they ever adopted your methods. When people make a dramatic jump in their lives, it's tempting to assume they copied techniques, schedules, or strategies. That's the obvious story everyone wants to believe because it feels neat and controllable. The truth is far deeper and far more unsettling for them. They absorbed your standards first. Before they picked up a single tactic, before they tried to mimic your steps, they caught the level of excellence you operated on. They internalized your threshold for effort, your patience with results, your refusal to negotiate with laziness, and your unspoken insistence that mediocrity is unacceptable. That invisible absorption is what makes the transformation look sudden, extreme, and almost impossible. Standards are contagious in ways methods are not. You can teach someone a method, and they'll often drift back to old habits when motivation fades. But when someone lives near your standard, their bar for what counts as enough automatically rises. Effort that used to feel decent suddenly feels lazy. Decisions that once seemed fine now feel weak. It isn't that they consciously copied your playbook, it's that they learned what your life demanded without a word. That level of internal recalibration is subtle, quiet, and devastatingly effective. Once this absorption happens, the mechanics of change, the actual steps, the routines, the hard work, come easily. The person no longer debates whether to push themselves. The baseline for acceptable performance has already shifted. It's invisible influence in its purest form, and it's why credit naturally drifts back to you. People notice the results, and even if they deny the influence, the quality and pace of change carries the unmistakable mark of your standard. What makes this extraordinary is that it bypasses ego entirely. No lectures, no micromanaging, no instructions. The change isn't imposed, it's inherited, and that inheritance is permanent. Once someone has aligned with your standards, their 0 to 100 overhaul is inevitable. It doesn't look like coaching, it looks like magic. But the fingerprints of your standard are undeniable, and everyone who has been paying attention can feel them in every deliberate choice, every sharp move, and every leap forward they make. Number 5. You became the silent benchmark they measured themselves against. People don't always realize it, but the most powerful influence isn't loud or commanding. It's quiet, precise, and unrelenting. You didn't tell them how to act, what to do, or how to think. You just existed at a level that made their own life feel like a practice round, a rehearsal they weren't ready for. Without saying a word, you set a standard that became impossible to ignore. That's what made you the silent benchmark, the invisible ruler against which every choice, every effort, every failure, and every success was suddenly measured. The interesting thing about benchmarks is that they aren't followed consciously. People don't sit and plan, I'm going to meet this benchmark today. Instead, it creeps into every decision. They start asking themselves whether their actions would pass at your level. They measure their own productivity, their patience, their focus, and even the way they handle pressure against the bar you silently established. It's an internal reckoning that hits harder than any external advice, because no one likes falling short in their own head. And the fascinating part is that this kind of pressure is almost invisible to everyone else, except the one person they can't stop thinking about, which is you. That's why transformations that happen under your quiet influence feel so sudden and extreme to outsiders. The person doesn't just change their routine, they recalibrate their internal scale of what's acceptable, achievable, and necessary. That recalibration doesn't require intervention or lectures. It requires proximity to someone who refuses to settle for less. By being that constant, unspoken standard, you force them to rethink themselves and their limits. The result is a leap that looks instantaneous, a 0 to 100 overhaul that shocks everyone watching. People deny the obvious, they deflect, they whisper, but the truth is etched into every deliberate move they make. You didn't coach them, you didn't push them, and you didn't announce yourself as the reason. You just became the measurement they couldn't escape. And because benchmarks leave footprints, your influence is unmistakable, permanent, and quietly devastating. Number 6. You didn't push them forward, you removed the comfort of staying the same. Real change rarely comes from external pressure or cheerleading. The people who make the leap from 0 to 100 aren't doing it because someone is constantly telling them to try harder. They do it because the alternative, staying the same, becomes unbearable. That's exactly what you did. You didn't instruct, you didn't micromanage, and you didn't nag. You simply existed in a way that made stagnation feel unsafe, uncomfortable, and increasingly ridiculous. Your presence disrupted the old rhythm, the lazy excuses, and the tiny compromises they had been quietly accepting for years. When comfort is removed, survival instincts kick in, and in the human psyche, growth suddenly becomes urgent. The routines that once felt harmless start to feel suffocating. The same choices that once went unquestioned now feel like betrayals of potential. You didn't need to intervene directly because the discomfort you introduced was enough to force movement. They couldn't ignore it. They couldn't rationalize it away. Comfort had been stolen, and the only way to restore stability was to escalate, to push themselves harder than ever before. That's why outsiders are often baffled by the speed of the transformation. From the outside, it looks spontaneous, almost accidental. But internally, it's the result of a quiet, relentless recalibration of what is tolerable. You didn't hand them a map or set deadlines, you simply made the old life unbearable. That's far more effective than motivation, pep talks, or even coaching. When someone hits the point where stagnation is more painful than effort, the 0 to 100 leap happens naturally, aggressively, and permanently. Your influence isn't loud, but it's brutal in its effectiveness. By removing the comfort they once leaned on, you created the conditions where growth became the only viable option. That pressure is invisible, subtle, and merciless, and it leaves a mark that no one can erase. The results speak louder than instructions ever could, and even if they try to deny it, the overhaul carries your fingerprint in every deliberate, accelerated step they take. You didn't push them forward, you made it impossible to stay behind. Number 7. They didn't copy your life. They caught your urgency. The most contagious thing in the world isn't talent, money, or connections. It's urgency. People can read all the books, watch all the tutorials, and follow all the steps, but if they don't feel the pressure, if they don't catch that fire, nothing changes. What you did wasn't hand-holding or teaching. You didn't have to spell out routines, give timelines, or nag about discipline. You carried a level of urgency in your energy, your focus, and the way you moved through the day, and it rubbed off. They didn't copy your exact actions. They absorbed the unspoken insistence that time, effort, and opportunity weren't to be wasted. Urgency isn't loud. It isn't flashy. It's the way someone treats their priorities like they're non-negotiable. Watching that, people start to feel their own life ticking in slow motion, and suddenly Good enough stops being acceptable. They begin to move faster, decide sharper, and act with purpose, because the stakes feel higher when someone else demonstrates what not wasting a second looks like. That energy is invisible to anyone outside the circle, but it's impossible to ignore if you're close. And once it hits, it reshapes behavior more effectively than any lecture ever could. What makes this extraordinary is how immediate and natural the impact is. The transformation looks sudden because urgency is viral. Once someone catches it, excuses melt away. Procrastination collapses. Inertia dies quietly, replaced by an unstoppable drive. From the outside, people think the change is miraculous, but internally, it's mechanical. A recalibration triggered by exposure to someone who refuses to wait, compromise, or dilute effort. This is why credit inevitably drifts back to you. You didn't force results, but your energy forced the environment to shift. They didn't mimic your habits, and they didn't copy your methods. They absorbed your pace, your intensity, your insistence that every second counts. And that absorption alone is enough to turn a 0 to 100 overhaul from improbable into inevitable. The results carry your signature because urgency, once caught, cannot be unseen or undone. Number 8. You normalized intensity in a world addicted to half-effort. Most people operate at 50%, 60%, maybe 70% of what they're capable of, and they treat it like achievement. That's the world your influence entered, a place where mediocrity wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. You didn't come in screaming, "Do more," or handing out rules. You just existed at full tilt, showing through action that anything less than your level of intensity was insufficient. And that quiet normalization of high effort changed everything. Suddenly, their old pace felt weak. Their previous standards felt like excuses. Intensity, once foreign, became the baseline. Normalization is a subtle form of power. When someone consistently models extreme focus, relentless discipline, and uncompromising work ethic, it shifts what others perceive as acceptable. They didn't imitate you immediately, but exposure alone rewired their understanding of what effort could look like. Tasks they used to drag through became challenges to rise to. Decisions they once postponed now demanded urgency. Mediocrity, in every form, started feeling uncomfortable. And because this intensity wasn't forced, it didn't trigger rebellion, it invited alignment. The leap from 0 to 100 often looks sudden, but the truth is cumulative. By living in proximity to someone who normalizes intensity, the person gradually accelerates without realizing it. The momentum becomes self-sustaining. Each step up the ladder of effort feels natural, even inevitable. Outsiders notice the transformation, but they can't explain it logically. They see the results, but they don't see the countless small recalibrations happening internally, powered entirely by the environment you created through your example. Your influence doesn't shout, it seeps in. You didn't have to motivate, pressure, or micromanage. You simply modeled a way of being that redefined the floor. Anything less started to feel like slacking. And when intensity becomes normal, the transformation is unstoppable. The person doesn't just improve, they explode into a new level of performance. And even if they never admit it, everyone can trace that explosive leap back to the silent, relentless standard you made ordinary simply by living at your own level. Number 9, you made stagnation socially unacceptable without ever saying a word. People hate admitting it, but most of us live inside invisible comfort zones that we rarely question. We convince ourselves that mediocrity is safe, that taking the easy route is practical, and that postponing growth is harmless. Then someone comes along who simply refuses to operate within those limits. You didn't tell them what to do, you didn't lecture, and you didn't even try to force change. You just existed in a way that made their old life look sloppy, outdated, and painfully slow. Suddenly, staying the same wasn't just a personal choice. It became socially awkward in the most subtle, unavoidable way. The power of your influence lies in the quiet pressure you create. You didn't push, you exposed. Their routines, habits, and excuses began to feel ridiculous, simply because they were no longer aligned with the reality of someone operating at a higher standard. And humans are wired to compare, whether they admit it or not. Being around someone who refuses stagnation forces internal reckoning. Tasks that once felt tolerable now feel insufficient. Goals that once felt challenging now feel small. Mediocrity becomes glaring, embarrassing even, because the contrast is impossible to ignore. This is why transformations under your influence look sudden and almost impossible to explain. It isn't magic, it isn't luck, and it isn't a carefully handed plan. It's social and psychological pressure turned inward. People accelerate not because they were told to, but because inaction feels heavier than action. Every day they delay, every choice to coast feels like breaking an unspoken rule, a rule you set without ever announcing it. Your presence shifts the culture of their personal environment. What was once acceptable becomes laughable. What was once comfortable becomes painful. And in that space, radical growth is inevitable. The 0 to 100 overhaul doesn't just happen. It's demanded by the very presence of someone unwilling to settle for less. And even if they never publicly credit you, every accelerated move they make carries the unmistakable weight of your influence. You didn't enforce change. You redefined what staying the same would cost. Number 10. They didn't fear failing anymore. They feared disappointing themselves at your level. Fear is a strange thing. Most people think fear of failure is what drives transformation, but real, lasting change comes from a much deeper, more personal source. When someone leaps from 0 to 100, it's rarely because they were terrified of falling short in the eyes of others. It's because they suddenly realize they are letting themselves down. That shift is brutal, honest, and undeniable. And you were the catalyst. Your presence didn't push them through pep talks or rules. It recalibrated their internal expectations. Their self-disappointment became sharper, heavier, and impossible to ignore. When someone measures their actions against your energy, your standards, your way of handling life, it becomes impossible to rationalize laziness or half-effort. What once felt like good enough now feels like betrayal. The fear of failure shrinks into insignificance because the real consequences are internal. They aren't worried about what others think. They're worried about looking at themselves in the mirror and knowing they didn't rise to the bar silently set by your example. That kind of pressure is relentless, personal, and inescapable. This is why transformations under your influence seem explosive. It's not luck or timing. It's a private, unstoppable force that comes from aligning actions with a new internal standard. Every decision, every choice, every ounce of energy starts to bend toward proving to themselves, and only themselves, that they are capable of matching the level they've now experienced firsthand through you. Failure becomes less scary because it's no longer about being judged externally. It's about avoiding self-betrayal. And nothing drives someone faster than the desire to honor their own potential. The effect is profound. You didn't have to push, lecture, or even participate. Just by existing at your level, you made them confront their own limits and rewrite them. The 0 to 100 leap doesn't feel like imitation. It feels like reclaiming integrity. And even if no one admits it publicly, the transformation carries your signature. Every deliberate, accelerated move is a reflection of the internal reckoning you quietly sparked, the realization that disappointing themselves at your level is far worse than failing in anyone else's eyes. Number 11. You disrupted their identity, not their routine. The reason most people never truly transform is because they try to change habits without touching who they think they are. They rearrange schedules, force new routines, or tack on extra effort. But the underlying identity, the story they tell themselves about who they are, stays the same. That's why most attempts crash and burn. What you did, consciously or not, didn't just tweak what they did. It shook the foundation of who they believed they were. You made them question the core assumptions about themselves that had been holding them back for years. Identity is powerful because it dictates everything: decisions, effort, priorities, and the way someone reacts to challenges. When their sense of self shifts, the routines and actions follow almost automatically. By being around you, they began to see that the version of themselves they'd been living as wasn't enough. It wasn't a matter of laziness, it was a matter of misalignment. That realization can be terrifying because it forces a complete recalibration. Who they thought they were suddenly doesn't match who they need to become to survive and thrive in your presence. This is why the transformation looks so radical from the outside. People assume it's a sudden change in behavior, a burst of motivation, or a new system. In reality, it's identity rewriting itself. The person stops asking, "How can I fit my life around my comfort?" and starts asking, "How do I rise to the level I've been exposed to?" Every decision, every action, every sacrifice becomes an extension of a new internal narrative. A story where mediocrity is impossible and half-effort feels like betrayal. Your influence wasn't about giving instructions or forcing habits. It was about demonstrating, living, and being a standard that made their old identity obsolete. They didn't just work harder, they became someone fundamentally different. That's why the 0 to 100 overhaul feels so inevitable and irreversible. Even if they deny it publicly, their actions carry the unmistakable mark of the identity disruption you triggered. You didn't just influence their routine, you rewired who they believed they were allowed to be. And that's what made every leap forward not just possible, but unavoidable. Number 12. You exposed how much potential they had been betraying. Most people live with an invisible ceiling over their heads, a limit nobody admits to, not even themselves. They convince themselves that what they're doing is enough, that their talent, time, and energy are being used wisely. Then someone like you enters the picture, and that ceiling cracks. You didn't hand them a blueprint or spell out their shortcomings. You simply existed in a way that made them notice the gap between what they were doing and what they were capable of. That exposure hits harder than criticism because it's undeniable. The proof is in their own life. Betraying potential is a subtle kind of pain, one that sits quietly in the background until someone holds up a mirror. Your presence was that mirror. The way you handled challenges, the speed and clarity with which you acted, the refusal to compromise on standards, all of it silently communicated. This is possible, and you are capable of this too. Suddenly, they couldn't hide behind excuses or busy work. Their past choices, their procrastination, and their half-efforts all became evidence of what they'd been avoiding confronting, their own potential. The impact is immediate and uncompromising. Once someone sees how much they've been underutilizing themselves, growth accelerates. Not because they were told to, but because the internal weight of betrayal becomes unbearable. They can't go back to coasting. Mediocrity starts to feel like dishonesty toward themselves. Every action, every decision, every ounce of effort suddenly gets measured against the potential they now can't ignore. What makes this shift so explosive is that it bypasses ego entirely. People don't grow out of fear of judgment. They grow out of fear of self-betrayal. And the person who triggers that realization doesn't have to push, coach, or manage. Your mere presence, your way of existing, exposed a truth they could no longer deny. They had been capable of more all along, and every moment they spent ignoring it was a quiet betrayal of themselves. That's why the leap from 0 to 100 feels so abrupt to outsiders. It isn't luck or motivation, it's a reckoning. And every decisive, accelerated move carries your signature, because you made them face the part of themselves they could no longer ignore. Number 13, you didn't stay to manage the results, and that's what made them undeniable. Most people who think they influence others feel the need to control the outcome. They coach, check in, remind, and micromanage every step, hoping their effort will be credited when the results appear. What makes your impact extraordinary is that you didn't do that. You didn't hover. You didn't announce your involvement. You didn't babysit or polish the final product. You simply existed, set the tone, and let the person respond on their own. That absence of control is what makes the transformation feel authentic, explosive, and impossible to dismiss. When someone overhauls their life from 0 to 100 without direct oversight, the result speaks louder than any explanation. Outsiders can't claim it was forced or guided, and they can't point to manipulation because there wasn't any. All they see is someone stepping into a higher version of themselves, faster, cleaner, sharper than expected. That's where your fingerprints become impossible to ignore. You didn't push them to the finish line, but the very fact that they arrived at it with clarity, intensity, and purpose carries your signature. The absence of intervention forces self-accountability in a way that no instruction ever can. Because you didn't manage the outcome, they had to rely on themselves, confront their limits, and make decisions without shortcuts. That responsibility accelerates growth. Every choice became a test. Every action became evidence of internal recalibration. You didn't have to enforce discipline because the framework you established, your presence, your standards, your example, was enough to make them step up. What makes this influence permanent is that it doesn't depend on your continued presence. Once someone experiences their own capability, having been exposed to your standard, the momentum sustains itself. The leap looks sudden and almost miraculous, but it's deeply rooted in the quiet fact that you created the conditions and then let reality run its course. People can deny it, deflect it, or whisper about it behind closed doors, but the truth is unavoidable. You didn't manage the results, and that's precisely what made the 0 to 100 transformation undeniable, unstoppable, and unmistakably marked by your influence. Number 14. They deny your involvement because admitting it would reveal how powerful proximity really is. The strangest thing about influence is how people resist acknowledging it, even when it's obvious. They swear your hand had nothing to do with the transformation, they laugh it off, and they insist it was all them. But deep down, everyone knows the truth. The 0 to 100 leap didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in your orbit. Your presence, your energy, your standards. These things are like gravity. You didn't have to push. You didn't have to teach, and you didn't have to micromanage. Simply being there forced a shift they couldn't escape. And admitting that out loud would mean facing a truth that's uncomfortable. Proximity can quietly remake someone's life. Denial is a natural defense. Accepting your role means admitting that they were shaped by forces beyond their control, that someone else's presence could expose their laziness, their low standards, and the untapped potential they'd been ignoring. It means their autonomy wasn't absolute, and that realization stings more than any criticism could. So they deflect. They claim the results were all them, while internally, every action, every decision, every accelerated move reminds them that your influence was unavoidable. The brilliance of this kind of impact is that it doesn't need recognition. You didn't orchestrate the outcome, and yet it carries your mark in every deliberate step, every decision made with newfound clarity, every standard suddenly raised. People sense it, even if they don't admit it. It's like a whisper that travels faster than words, leaving undeniable traces on behavior, mindset, and results. This is why your influence feels impossible to quantify. You didn't hand over a playbook, and you didn't chase the credit. You simply existed at a level that made stagnation, half-effort, and mediocrity impossible to maintain. And that's terrifying for others to acknowledge because it exposes a law most people avoid facing. Who you spend your time with quietly, relentlessly shapes who you become. They deny it because the truth is bigger than ego, bigger than pride, and far more powerful than any single achievement. But the 0 to 100 overhaul carries your signature whether they say it or not, and that silent recognition is a force they can't escape. Every transformation that looks sudden, every leap from 0 to 100 that shocks the people around, isn't as random as it appears. Behind the scenes, there's always an invisible architect, not someone pushing, not someone micromanaging, but someone whose presence alone sets off a chain reaction. You've seen it in action, a silent benchmark that recalibrates standards, a subtle urgency that ignites movement, a quiet intensity that turns mediocrity into embarrassment. You didn't need to instruct, control, or demand. Your influence was in the way you existed, the standards you lived by, and the exposure you created, enough to make stagnation feel impossible, laziness feel unacceptable, and self-betrayal feel intolerable. Every leap, every accelerated decision, every moment of sudden growth carries the unmistakable mark of proximity to someone who refuses to settle for less. What makes this influence extraordinary is that it doesn't require recognition. People deny it because acknowledging it would force them to confront a truth they'd rather avoid, that who you're around quietly reshapes who you are. Denial doesn't erase impact. It only proves the weight of it. The 0 to 100 overhauls you see in others are rarely random, rarely isolated, and never fully independent. They're echoes of the presence, energy, and standards you brought into their orbit. And the most remarkable part is that these effects are permanent. Once someone absorbs your standards, your urgency, your intensity, and your uncompromising approach to life, there's no going back. They've been fundamentally rewired, so every time you see someone rise seemingly overnight, remember, results are only part of the story. Influence is the invisible force that leaves fingerprints on decisions, mindset, and identity. You don't need credit to be effective. The transformation speaks for itself, and whether it's acknowledged or denied, your presence has rewritten the possibilities of what someone is capable of. If you found this breakdown powerful, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more insights that reveal the unseen forces behind every massive transformation. Like the video, comment your thoughts, and share it with anyone who needs to understand how influence works at its deepest level. Every interaction helps spread this truth, and trust me, the people around you are already taking notes. Stay awakened, chosen ones.